Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're doing something pretty exciting. We are going to explore the absolute mechanics of the universe, right alongside the theology of the divine, to answer a truly fascinating question. We'll be pulling from some deep concepts in both modern physics and historic Christian theology to uncover how ultimate reality operates. Okay, let's dive into this. Is the ultimate divine power of the universe just an invisible force? I mean, does the divine operate like the invisible mathematical forces of quantum physics, or is it something entirely different? It's a massive question, and the answer you land on fundamentally changes how you view reality. Think about it for a second. On one hand, we have the rigid mechanical rules of quantum physics. Down at the subatomic level, particles move based on cold mathematical probabilities and wave functions. It is a strictly impersonal system. But then, on the other hand, we see the traditional Christian theological definition of God, an uncreated, highly relational, and deeply personal triune God. These are literally two completely opposite ways of looking at ultimate power. Section 1. The active force misconception. Here is where it gets highly debated. Some theological groups actually interpret the Holy Spirit exactly like a quantum wave function, basically as a mere mechanical power or energy field, completely devoid of personality. For example, groups like Jehovah's Witnesses formally teach that the Holy Spirit is simply God's active force. In this view, the Spirit lacks any distinct personality. It's essentially treated as the divine equivalent of electricity or gravity. It's just a tool used by God rather than a conscious who. Now, this impersonal interpretation usually relies on two main arguments. First, they point out that the original Greek word for spirit, pneuma, is actually a neuter noun. Second, they highlight verses where the Spirit is strongly associated with power. Like, when the Spirit comes upon Samson in the Old Testament to give him immense physical strength. And honestly, it sounds pretty plausible at first glance, right? So, the crucial point is there's a big logical fallacy here. Theologians are quick to point out that it's a mixing of categories. Having infinite power does not inherently mean something lacks personhood. Divine omnipotence and willful action are completely different from blind mechanical forces like gravity or quantum fields. Furthermore, in the Greek language, grammatical noun genders, like neuter or feminine, don't actually dictate person identity anyway. So, if the Spirit is not a blind force, what is it? Section 2. Argument 1. Mind and will. To really build the theological case for personhood, we have to start in Romans chapter 8. It says, "The Spirit himself intercedes for us. He who searches the heart knows what is the mind of the Spirit." Notice how the text explicitly applies highly personal capacities to the Spirit right here. A mindless force simply cannot search a human heart. Let's break down the specific verbs and actions from these texts. The Spirit helps us in our weakness. He intercedes and prays for the saints. He possesses a distinct mind. And over in 1 Corinthians 12, we see the Spirit distributes spiritual gifts as He wills. These actions, praying, thinking, making willful choices, they absolutely require a conscious person, not a blind mathematical force. You literally cannot have a will without a person behind it. Section 3. Argument 2. Relational actions. Listen to Jesus' own words in the Gospel of John, chapter 16. "When the Spirit of truth comes, he will guide you into all the truth, for he will not speak on his own authority, but whatever he hears, he will speak." Now, what's really interesting about this is the grammar in the original Greek language. Remember how the word for spirit is technically a neuter noun? Well, right here, the text deliberately uses masculine pronouns, saying he will guide you. It's specifically overriding the grammar to emphasize the Spirit's relational, personal agency. Let's map these actions out a bit further. Jesus calls the Spirit another helper, using a Greek word that means a helper of the exact same kind as Jesus himself. The Spirit guides into truth, hears information, speaks, instructs believers on what to say when they are on trial, and even uses first-person pronouns, like in Acts 10 when the Spirit says, "I have sent them." Teaching, hearing, guiding, and speaking in the first person are strictly relational actions. A mechanical power like an entangled quantum field simply cannot perform them. Section 4. Argument 3. Emotional capacity. So we've seen mind, will, and relational action. But beyond all of that, the third and perhaps the most striking scriptural argument is emotional capacity. The Apostle Paul writes in Ephesians 4:30, "And do not grieve the Holy Spirit of God, by whom you are sealed for the day of redemption." This actually echoes back to the Old Testament in Isaiah 63, where the Spirit is also described as being rebelled against and deeply grieved by the Israelites. And this brilliantly illustrates a fundamental difference in how we interact with the universe. Think about it. You can resist an impersonal force. You can block a literal wind, but you can't hurt the wind's feelings. You can stop an electrical current, but you can't cause electricity emotional pain. You can't let gravity down. You can only grieve a person. This points directly to the Spirit's deep, personal capacity to feel sorrow and love. Section 5. The personal divine. So if the Holy Spirit is a distinct person with a mind, will, and emotions, how does this fit into the broader picture of God? Well, we can synthesize these scriptural arguments into the formal Christian doctrine of the Trinity. In historic Christian theology, God is neutrally defined as a tri-personal being. There is one uncreated divine being existing simultaneously as three distinct, co-equal persons, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, who all perfectly interact with one another. Theologians argue that this framework resolves a pretty profound philosophical question: how God can eternally be love. True love requires multiple persons interacting in a relationship. A singular, isolated entity can't express love without first creating something to love, but a tri-personal God is loved by his very nature. Let's see how this builds step by step in the story of redemption. The persons of the Trinity perfectly interact harmoniously. First, the Father sends the Son. Second, the Son redeems creation through his sacrifice. Third, the Holy Spirit indwells, guides, and seals believers. This is a dynamic, living relationship between distinct persons which is entirely separate from a localized mechanical quantum system. It's not a blind wave function collapsing. It's a willful, orchestrated act of divine love. Which brings us to our final thought. The physics that govern our physical universe, quantum mechanics, entanglement, probability distributions, are all built on impersonal rules. But if ultimate divine power isn't a mere force, but rather a deeply personal relationship, how does that change our understanding of reality? It leaves us to ponder the profound difference between a universe governed entirely by cold, unfeeling physics and one intimately sustained by a personal, relational God. It really does change absolutely everything. Thanks for joining me for this explainer, and keep diving into these big concepts.